Hey, Mike Raine here with Canadian Musician Magazine right now in Toronto, and the man next to me, you've probably already recognized him. I guess it's fair to say a living legend at this point, Bruce Cockburn, one of the one of the greatest modern songwriters in Canada, inductee into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame, member of the Order of Canada, now releasing, coming up in September 20th, if I remember correctly.
That sounds right.
Yeah, 34th album, which is incredible. It's going to be called Crowing Ignites, which I don't usually ask about song titles, but I do want to ask about that one. But anyways, Bruce, just before we get into it, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And,
Living legend, I'm not so sure, but living for, still. In spite of the odds, I guess.
And actually, before we talk about the new album, Crowing Ignites, which is an all-instrumental album, I just want to first say how much I loved Bone on Bone, your previous album. I didn't talk to you during that album cycle, and in preparation for this interview, went back and listened to it again. I was like, wow, this is a killer group of songs here. So, and when I was, again, in preparation for this, so coming across some of the reviews for Bone on Bone, and it received pretty exceptional reviews.
It was very well received, actually. I was happy to have that be the case, and it had been quite a while between albums when that one came out, because I got involved
6 or 7 years from that.
Yeah, well, I spent 3 or 4 of them writing a book, and didn't write any songs. And so when the songs started coming, I was really happy, and I was very pleased with how the album came out. So I mean, how it came out musically and so on, and then the reception it got was very gratifying too.
Yeah. What I'm curious about is, at this point in your career, you've been going for 50-ish years now at this point.
Yeah, I mean, this year is the 50th anniversary of the recording of my first album. So,
and that was your 33rd. This will be your 34th, obviously. So I'm wondering, is at this point in your career, can you be subjective? Like when you create an album like Bone on Bone that goes on to be so critically acclaimed, at this point, do you know that's coming? Can you be subjective and know how an album stacks up to previous work and so on?
I don't think about that at all. No. I mean, I just try to make each one live according to its own terms. We go in the studio and we do the best we can to make a good record out of the material that's there, and you never know how a thing is going to be taken. I mean, especially now when there's a whole different way of getting music out to people than I've lived with most of my life. So I don't even really have a good handle on how that works at this point. So the fact that people liked the album, and there was a very short time lag between the release of the album and the audience is starting to recognize the songs, which was always a good sign too. So
when it comes to reception, not just critical reception, but fan reception, that kind of stuff, how much of it, I don't know if you ever thought about that, like how much of it do you think is purely the music and the music works in any time and era, and how much does it rely on music and timing and the political situation, the social situation, all of that kind of meeting at the right moment? Know what I mean?
I think that all of those factors play a big part. I mean, you can have the best album in the world, and if the circumstances are working against you, then no one will hear it, or at least not for a long time, maybe. Sometimes things are sleepers, and they sort of show up later. But and of course, we all know that sometimes terrible albums appear and become very popular. so it's really there's a lot of outside factors. Yeah. But I mean, I can somewhat predict that because I have a history, as long as it is. I mean, I know that there's people out there that also aren't dead yet that are still going to look for my music and want to listen to it. And actually, I mean, kind of joking about not being dead yet, but although I have a lot of older people in my audience, there's also an increasing number of young people showing up at shows, which is very exciting too for me, because when I think of an audience of just people my age or whatever, there's a scene in the Peter O'Toole movie, The Ruling Class. I don't know if people remember that movie. It's an old one now, but it's a dark satire, dark satire on English kind of culture, the aristocracy and so on. And there's a scene in the House of Lords where they're all sitting there, and they look like kind of dead, and desiccated bodies, and cobwebs going off from heads to the wall and so on. And that image pops into my mind whenever I sort of think of my audience as getting old and dying with me. It's like, I don't want to go there. I mean, not that I have anything against the people that are my age. I don't at all, of course. But it's just nice to see some young, fresh faces coming to the show.
Do you have a theory as to why that's happening? Is it young people?
Well, I don't really have a theory exactly, but I think that at a certain point, if you're still around and still functioning, a second generation may notice you. Like that happened with guys like Mississippi John Hurt, the old blues guys that were sort of rediscovered in the '60s and acquired a college age audience. And lived on that, lived with that for the rest of their lives, and so nobody knows how it's all going to play out, but it might be something like that phenomenon. But the world is different in many ways now, but one of the ways is that young people like their parents' music, which was not true when I was young. I mean, none of us wanted to be anywhere near our parents' music, but I get kids coming up to me, and I mean kids of all ages, little kids and teenagers and 20-somethings will come up and go, "Oh yeah, I grew up with your music. I really love it," and it's great to hear, but it's surprising less so now because it's happened enough times. But I just would have never gone to hear my parents' music willingly. I might have gone out of politeness or something, but not be enthusiastic about it. They were into musicals and My Fair Lady and stuff like that, and it's just not my thing.
I guess one of, there's lots of pros and cons of streaming, obviously, but I guess also one of the factors of it is that kids have access to their parents' music, know what I mean?
Yeah.
If someone hears about, say, a contemporary artist mention you as an influence, they have immediate access to your entire discography.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everything that's ever been done is available. Yeah. I mean, since recording started, and that has changed the picture hugely. I think that's a very important part of the picture. But anyway, it's interesting, and it's working out well so far. So.
To shift gears to the new album, Crowing Nights, again, coming out September 20th on True North Records. Like I mentioned, it's an instrumental record, so kind of the obvious question off the bat is just why? Like, I don't mean that in I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but essentially, you're known as a premier songwriter. So why an instrumental album at this time?
Well, I like playing the guitar a lot.
Yeah.
When I started out to sort of imagining myself living with music, I didn't think of writing songs. I went to music school to study composition. I was expecting that I would end up writing music for large jazz ensembles, and I dropped out before I acquired all of those chops. But and because it became apparent that whatever direction I was supposed to pursue, it wasn't that one. But now I've lost the thread. I got so thinking all about music school.
Sorry.
Well, no, yeah. Remind me what we're talking about.
Essentially, just why now is the right time for an instrumental album, or why that's what you wanted to do right now.
Business at hand, right? Okay, so. We started out, it was actually Bernie Finkelstein's idea, my manager. And this goes back a few years, but after Bone on Bone came out, he said, you should do an instrumental album. We could do like Speechless 2, because we put out an album a few years ago that was all called Speechless, that was a collection of previously released tracks plus a few new ones. And so we had the idea, that idea just germinated over time, and I started thinking, it'd be fun to do that. So that was our plan. We were going to do Speechless 2, but then I ended up writing so much new stuff that it just became its own entity. So it isn't Speechless 2, it's Crowing Ignites, and it doesn't sound like Speechless, although it is primarily an acoustic guitar album. You know, so.
How does the writing, the composition process for an instrumental track compare to writing a song?
Totally different, because for the way I write a song, at least, I start with lyrics, at least enough lyrics to kind of see where it's going, and then I try to apply music to those lyrics in a way that's, I've said this before, but it's the best way I can describe it. It's analogous to scoring a film. So you have ideas and images and so on, and you want music that supports those things without overpowering them. So, but an instrumental piece, of course, doesn't have any of those considerations at all. It just exists. So, and those pieces come out of practicing, from just exploring on the guitar. And there were two of the pieces on the album were constructed in the studio with me just adding layer upon layer of different things. One of them starts with a pattern on a little charango and just a repeated pattern. And then I just added things from there. Colin Linden who produced the album, put a baritone guitar part on that track. But otherwise, it's charango and dulcimer and 12-string guitar and all kinds of stuff. The other piece that we put together in the studio, I'm playing baritone, and the baritone is sort of riding on an ocean of singing bowls and gongs and all sorts of stuff like that. So these are very atmospheric pieces that were spontaneous, basically. But the other pieces on the album were things that I came up with at home, and there's a lot of them have improvised sections to them, but they're composed pieces more or less.
Is it with songs maybe more like those ones? Is it immediately apparent to you that this is an instrumental track, or do you ever kind of start it and be like, actually, I have some words for this? You know what I mean?
No, I couldn't say that would never happen, but it didn't. No, it's not how I work normally. No, I'm trying to think if that's ever really worked like that. The closest thing I can picture at the moment to that was writing a song called "All the Diamonds in the World" long ago, and the lyrics started to come, but before they were anywhere near finished, it became apparent to me that it wanted a hymn-like music, which is not really. I mean, I don't usually use a lot of chord changes in my songs. I prefer, ideally, not to have any. Actually, I like the freedom of not having chord changes. But that song wanted something that sounded kind of churchy. So I constructed something that sounded that way, and then finished the lyrics to the music. But usually, the lyrics are there. Sometimes lyrics will sit around for a long time before I get the right music for them, or they'll go through a few different kinds of musical approaches before I find the right one. But sometimes it all just pops out.
How do you know when, with instrumental tracks like these, how do you know when they're done? Like with a typical song, you know what I mean? Like you're like, all right, you do the third verse, you do the final chorus, you're like, all right, I have nothing really more I need to say in this song. I guess I'll wrap it up now. How do you know when an instrumental track is done?
The principle is the same. It just doesn't have words attached to it. So, there's, okay, I've come up with this thing on the guitar, but it needs something to go with it. Okay, so I'll look for something to go with it. And then that might still feel like part of a piece, maybe because it's short, or maybe because it just feels like it wants to be completed in some way that I haven't thought of yet. So sometimes at that point, a piece will take quite a different direction, and some new element will be injected into it. Other times it just happens that there's something that's quite close, but it's kind of the same idea as a verse, chorus, but it may not be that orderly. Sometimes it is like that. There's a piece called Blind Willie that's on the album that's largely improvised, but there's a riff that I just sort of imagined it as a kind of the door keeps slamming over here. We should explain to the folks what that actually is, because people are walking through the lobby of the hotel and into the restaurant next door, and every time they do that, the door slams. But Blind Willie it has a kind of chorus that's a riff that's repeated, but in between the choruses, it's just improvised. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking of gospel songs, and we're going to hear some more noise in a second. The way old spirituals worked and so on. Which is one of the reasons I named it after Blind Willie Johnson, who was one of the greatest of the street gospel singers of the 20s. Yeah. So anyway, that yeah. There's another story like that with all of the pieces, but we may not want to spend time on it like that.
I just want to bring some, like when Bernie Finkelstein, your longtime manager, head of True North Records, I was chatting with him before he arrived, and we were talking about some of the shows and stuff you have coming up, and I said something about you've kind of reached the privileged point where you can kind of just do what you want, and Bernie said, he's at the point where he can do what he wants, but he kind of got there by doing what he wants, which is a good line. I'm wondering, like, how was that the case? Do you know what I mean? Like, essentially, what's always been the, I guess, philosophical, political, mental approach, whatever you want to call it. Essentially, what's been the approach to your career that it's worked out that way?
I think the main approach is that I've never thought in terms of career. I'm uncomfortable with the word. I'm not with you using it, but I don't use it because I just don't see. I've never approached what I do that way. I want to be good at what I do. I work at improving it and so on. But I've never had this sort of image in my mind of like, okay, 2 years from now I'm going to be in this place, and 5 years from now I'm going to be in this place. I'm not a planner. I kind of just try to take the next step when I'm invited to do it, by life. So when I dropped out of music school, I had no idea what I was going to do. I ended up joining a band in Ottawa that my friends had started, but all I knew when I dropped out was that my life was going to be tied up with the guitar in some way, and if it ended up that I was playing for pennies in the subway, so be it. That approach hasn't changed. It's still, I have the same feelings about it now.
And for folks that don't know your background, it's not just any music school you dropped out of. You were studying jazz composition at the Berklee School of Music in Boston. One of the most renowned music schools. To do that, to drop out like that, I would assume either you're very reckless or you're very confident, or some combination of the two. But I'm wondering at what point you knew you were better than average, I suppose, that there was something to it.
It wasn't about that. It was. In fact, that would be very far from the truth. But no, I just had the sense that I felt a prompting. It was not literally a voice, but it was as if a voice said to me, "It's time for you to go from here." And so I trusted that, and I went, and that's kind of been the MO ever since. I mean, it's sometimes those promptings come in the form of exterior events, people you meet, or events that you're sort of put in front of in your life. Sometimes it comes from a more internal place, and it's just like, okay, it's time to it's time to make a choice. And I guess that's really what it is. It's about choices. Sometimes choices are obvious. You're confronted with a situation where you have to pick A or B to get through it. But other times the choice is more subtle, and you may not even know that you're expected to make a choice. But sometimes, I think whether it's intuition or God or however you want to define that, I mean I think in terms of God, but other people may not. But there is a voice that will, if you listen, will steer you, and so I've always just tried to heed that voice.
Is that voice in the music too? Like, are you ever trying to convey that within your lyrics?
Maybe in a subtle sort of way. I mean, I think I've probably made references to that in songs. I I can never think of my song lyrics when I'm not singing the song. But it's certainly there as an undertone through all of what I've done. I think. I don't know if it's. I don't have that objective a view of what I do really. So, and I don't spend much time standing back reflecting on it. It's like I'm kind of mostly interested in what's next.
Yeah. Do you remember the first time you wrote a song that you wanted to share? That essentially the first time you wrote a song, you're like, I know this is a subjectively good song.
Well, I don't really remember. You know, I remember writing certain of the old. I remember writing certain of the early songs on that are on the first two albums. Say, a song like "Going to the Country." I kind of felt like that really worked. It didn't at first because I wrote the lyrics, but the music that was in my head that was kind of, you know, that I imagined those lyrics going with was a kind of shuffle blues thing, and I was kind of riffing off of the old blues song "Going to the Country," you know, whatever. So that turned out not to be the music that it wanted to have, that those lyrics wanted to have. It just sounded stupid with my language and my sensibilities and my, you know, my upbringing, background, etc. Trying to be applied to that music was artificial as all get out. So I had to look for other music, and when I came up with what there is, it seemed to work really well. So, you know, that felt like a pretty complete song. And then the test is, it's not the only test, but a major test for how well a song works is how people respond to it. Some songs are more challenging for an audience on first hearing than others. So, you know, a complicated song might take people more hearings to kind of get a grip on, and then that test doesn't hold up so well. But with simple songs and kind of catchy things like that, if it's going to work, you can kind of tell right away. And not just because of how people react, but how I feel. The audience becomes a kind of mirror held up to this. And am I embarrassed to be singing this, or am I confident in this? And so it's Going to the Country was a song like that. There was another old song, Dialogue with the Devil, that's on the third or fourth album, fourth I think, that was a more complicated song, or a song like Gavin's Woodpile. These are songs that people that were around in that era ask for from time to time, and I haven't played them for a long time, but they were much more complex lyrically and musically than Going to the Country. But the same thing held. You know, if you play it for people, and if people are listening, then, and you can always tell if they are or not, then you can feel a reaction, even if it's not the kind of song that people will whistle and stomp after hearing. You know, I mean, it's you can feel from an audience whether they are relating to it or not.
Mm-hmm. Kind of on that note, it reminds me of something I actually seen Paul McCartney, or someone talking about something Paul McCartney had said actually recently about essentially what he referred to as the audience being a black hole during newer songs. What he was essentially saying is he plays a Beatles song, all the phones, all the, you know, come out, and the place lights up. Pull out a newer song, they all go away, and it turns into this black cavern, you know, that he looks out into. You know, there's two sides to that. One's like, you have these amazing songs that everyone wants to hear. You know, millions of artists would die to have that problem. Know what I mean? Yeah. But at the same time, as a songwriter, you have to. I'm sure there's some frustration there when people are more interested in the older stuff than the newer stuff. I'm just kind of wondering how you handle that.
I think that. I think it's. There's a couple of things involved there. The nature of the audience is one of them. I mean, I don't try to write crowd-pleasing songs. Paul McCartney maybe does. I don't know what he thinks when he writes. You know, but his strongest songs are songs that are very accessible, mm-hmm. And so you know, I think he plays to an audience that likes very accessible mm-hmm. songs. Mm-hmm. My audience likes accessible songs, but they're also tolerant of and perhaps some of them prefer songs that ask more of them. And so it's a little different, and I don't know, it's hard to. I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about this. It's hard to really say anything very meaningful about these things, because it just kind of happens. I've had the experience of putting a song out for people and not having them respond well. Not so much lately, but in the earlier days that happened. And then you get a sense, so it's okay, well, yeah, then you make a choice. Am I going to keep singing this song in spite of that, or am I going to just shelve it or put it back in the notebook as grist for, raw material for some future song? Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's happened. But most of the time, people either respond excitedly or politely, and there's not too much negativity there.
Yeah. Kind of one other question along those lines is, in terms of how you, like, when you have a few classic songs, like you do, a few like songs that everyone in the audience is going to know, such as If I Had a Rocket Launcher, that maybe you're expected to play at all or most shows. Again, to pull from something I've seen another legend say, when Bob Dylan has talked about this kind of thing, his mentality's always been how, like a Rolling Stone was on record, was only the way he felt like playing it that day in the studio. It's not the way he's obligated to play it for the rest of his life. And you see that in his shows, certainly. But then I've talked to other people like Kim Mitchell and Randy Bachman who have songs like that everyone in the audience is going to know and want to hear. And they feel more of like an obligation or a service to the paying audience to give them what they want. For you, being also one of those types of songwriters with those types of songs, what's your mentality?
I'd be more in the Kim Mitchell camp. I think, although I feel free to do whatever I want. If I want to change a song, I will, but I don't want to. I mean, it's like I write these things; they're done. Mm-hmm. I try to make them as complete as I can when I write them, and I don't record them until I think that I've reached that point with them. Mm-hmm. So, if people are attached to those songs, I think it's fair. If somebody pays good money for a ticket to a show, they should get to hear at least some of what they want to hear. And it doesn't mean the whole show has to be that, and I think that would be a mistake too. I think you can overdo that kind of consideration, but I think it's important to, just a sign of respect for the audience, to give them a version of. I mean, if I play Rocket Launcher solo, it doesn't sound like it does on the record. It's the same chord changes, the same lyrics, the same melody, everything, but it has a very different feel for people. So, and I'm comfortable with that. There's others, but I don't see myself changing lyrics, for instance, except a word here and there, maybe. I've probably done that 3 or 4 times over the 50 years, where I think of a word that's actually much better than the one I originally wrote into the song in a particular context. But otherwise, it's the other thing that changes the style of a song for me, or the way I do a song, is also based on the solo performing. A lot of the stuff I recorded in the 80s depended on a band. And on either side of that, the songs are written pretty much with the guitar part composed right into the song. So it's a complete entity, when I play it by myself, and we can add other musicians to it if we want. But they got to work around the guitar part. But with the 80s stuff, the guitar parts, as the bands got bigger, the guitar parts kept shrinking and just almost shrinking down to little electric rhythm parts and so on. And so to do those songs solo, so I'm thinking of a song like World of Wonders, which is quite different solo. I mean, I incorporated part of a horn riff into the guitar part that I use now when I play it, but and it worked out really well. But I think, but those things are relatively exceptional. All the stuff that I've written since the 80s is very workable in any format, So.
Colin Linden, obviously of Blackie and the Roto Kings. This is Crowing Ignites is going to be the 10th album, I believe, that he's produced for you.
I don't keep track, but yeah, he's been my producer since the mid '90s, let's say. Yeah.
So I'm just curious about that relationship, what it is that he brings to the table musically, personally, whatever it may be, that keeps you wanting to go back to him.
It's nice to work with a guitar player, and Colin and I have been friends for a long time. I first met him when he was 14 back in the 70s, and he showed up as a child prodigy at the Mariposa Folk Festival. Colin has acquired really great studio chops. He has a deep understanding of how to make things sound good, what mics to use, where to put them, where to place any given instrument in a room, and all that kind of stuff. He's very good at that, and we've, I guess the first time we worked together as producer and artist, we had played together before that. It was an experiment, but he'd been producing some stuff, and it sounded good, and I liked the idea of trying it out, and it worked with the Charity of Night, and then it worked again with Breakfast in New Orleans, Dinner in Timbuktu, and then it just kept on working. The one album that Colin didn't produce of the last many was Life's Short Call Now, which Jonathan Goldsmith produced, and I asked Jonathan to do it because he's really a gifted writer for strings, and I wanted something orchestral happening on parts of the album, and he also is an excellent producer. So, that was a bit of a sidestep in a way in terms of working with Colin, but it's that scenario. Works the same way as all the rest of what I do. Is each time out, it's like, okay, well, who's going to produce the album this time? This Bone on Bone just seemed to be a real natural for Colin, because a lot of it's kind of blues oriented, and Colin's bass, as is mine in terms of guitar playing. I mean, we both cut our teeth trying to learn to play blues like old black men, and Colin did a little better at it than I did in terms of the authenticity of his stuff and his relationship to that whole culture. But we see very much eye to eye on a lot of musical things for that reason. But and with the instrumental thing, it was like, yeah, well, we know that Colin's going to do a good job. We know, and we had when we did Speechless, the new pieces on that were recorded at my house near Kingston, Ontario, and that Colin brought in portable stuff for that, and it worked out really well. And we recorded this Crowing Ignites in San Francisco, where I'm living now, but I had to figure out how to do the album without having to be away because of family dynamics, you could say. So, and the logistics of getting my 7-year-old daughter to and from school. We found, one of those universal or cosmic sort of moments. I got acquainted with a neighbor who has a building that was a former firehouse that was made into a residential space, and I'd been to a party there where they had a Greek band playing, an acoustic band. It was really fantastic, and the acoustics in the place were really fantastic. And so I just asked her, how would you feel about me taking over the firehouse for a week to record an album? She reflected on that for about 30 seconds and said, yeah, great, it's a great idea. So we got to do that, and it happens that place is like 2 blocks from where I live, so it worked out very well. And we had a great week in there, and then we mixed the album at Colin's studio in Nashville.
Doing a location thing like that, it reminds me, like a while ago, talked to Mark Howard. I'm not sure if you know Mark Howard, the engineer. He's kind of been the long-time right-hand man of Daniel Lanois, the producer. Right. They've recorded, many classic albums together. And kind of one of their regular things is they're always rarely recording in a studio. They're usually taking over, something like the Firehouse or, something along those lines to record in for regardless of who they're working with. All that just asked essentially for you, what did that element bring to it? Do you think this album is different because of that than it would have been had you been in a studio?
Well, it's hard to say what if, but it probably is different because the room and the convenience of it all. Well, convenient for me, or less convenient for Colin, who had to come from Nashville and hang out in San Francisco for a week. But there's a relaxation factor there where the clock's not ticking in any significant way, and we just have the space. We're doing a very simple thing. I mean, I don't know if it would have worked as well if we were trying to record a band in a situation like that. It might have, but it certainly worked well for what we were doing. Most of the time, it was just me and Colin in the room, and Daniel Keebler, who did photography. Daniel Keebler, who did the photography for Bone on Bones, the Bone on Bone packaging, came and photographed a lot of the sessions and the atmosphere of the place. And there's a guy named Bo Carper that I know is a great guitar player in San Francisco, but also. I asked him if he knew any percussionists, and he said, well, he gave me a couple of names, but that didn't pan out. And he said, well, if you want a shaker player, I'm a really great shaker player. And I thought, well, okay, I mean, I don't know what that means, great shaker player, but he came in and he was amazing. Like he had such a sense of texture and subtlety and little rhythmic maneuvers that we got him on a couple of tracks, and it's really great. So it was fun and very relaxed. I've worked in all kinds of different studios, and the big expensive studios, the famous ones in LA or the famous ones that used to be in Toronto, were great in their way, but the atmosphere is very different. I mean, you have the sense of, if you better not be wasting any time in those places, and you have a sense that you're also running into other people that are using other rooms, and that can be interesting and kind of convivial, but it can also be distracting and just kind of feel like clutter. Mm-hmm. So we had the best of everything kind of in this little situation.
Before we wrap up here, I just want to bring back up Bernie Finkelstein again. First of all, how long have you been with Bernie? I know it's been a long time.
We started working together in 1969.
Oh, from the very beginning. I didn't realize it went right back to the beginning.
Well, the beginning of that phase of things. Yeah, I mean, I date the thing I don't call a career from basically the end of 1965 when I dropped out of Berkeley. Yeah. So
that's exactly what I talk about when you say the thing you don't want to call a career is if you're going to reach the heights. Obviously, great songs, all of that, are key to it. But even if you're not going to treat it like a career, to reach the heights you have, somebody has to. That's usually your manager. Yeah. Obviously, now 50 years with Bernie, something there has been working on both sides of this. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about that relationship. Why that? Because I can't think of any other artist-manager relationship that's lasted 50 years. I'm sure there's some.
I think Neil Young and Elliot Roberts lasted that long, but then Elliot recently passed away. So that's over for those guys. But yeah, I don't. It's not a common thing, that's for sure. I mean, all the artists that I've kind of had a chance to hang out with have all been through many managers, or they don't have one at all. In some cases. But those are artists that have a talent for business that I don't have. And yeah, you're right. Without somebody like Bernie, and in my case it is Bernie, kind of having a sense of strategy and having a kind of and being capable of making longer range plans, it'd be very difficult to build on any success that you have. I mean, people, if you get a little bit of success, you get all kinds of people coming up and saying, "Hey, I can get you to the next level," But whether they're telling the truth or not, it's another matter. And a lot of people have good intentions and don't have the know-how. But Bernie had both, and it's just kept working.
Interesting. Did he see something essentially, what are the complementing? Because usually for this type of thing to work, you have to have complementing characteristics and areas of talent, of intelligence. Know what I mean? Like that. He has to be good in areas where you're not.
Well, yeah, but you'd have to ask him how he sees that. I think, but for me, in the beginning, it was one of those things. It was a choice. We made the first album because Gene Martinek, who produced my first 10 albums, he used to be a guitar player in a band called the Kensington Market, and Bernie had managed that band, so he knew Bernie. Gene was, the band had broken up. Gene was free, and he and I ran into each other one day in Yorkville and sat having a coffee in the Upper Crust Cafe. And I said, yeah, I really want to make a record because I felt like the songs I'd written were choking me up. I wanted to. I was so naive about this at the time. I've got to record these songs so I can get rid of them and forget about them and make room in my brain for new ones. It doesn't work like that, of course, but I thought it would. And Gene said, well, yeah, I want to be a producer. I'm really looking to produce an album. We may have something here. And he said, and Bernie wants to start a record company. I'm going to go talk to him about this. So he brought Bernie down to a show I was doing, and we all had a chat, and it was decided that we'd go ahead with my first album, which was also the first True North album, with Bernie rounding up money for it and Gene producing it. Bernie really liked the fact that I didn't want any production. I mean, not that I didn't want a producer, but that I didn't want. I wanted to make an album that was like a Mississippi John Hurt album. That was like you go in the studio and you play your songs, and I didn't want an orchestra, and I didn't all the stuff that a lot of singer-songwriters were, in my view, having inflicted on them at that time in the studio. And I just didn't want any part of that stuff. And so Bernie liked the idea that it was going to be a cheap album and he didn't have to work too hard to get the money. And it just went on from there. It worked. We did that album, and it got on the radio right away. And it just went from there. But at a certain point, the people were coming after Bernie, like, well, how do we get hold of Bruce to do shows and stuff like that? So he said, you're going to need a manager. And he volunteered his services for that. And, I didn't know him all that well, but I knew he'd done that kind of work before and had some success at it. So it just seemed like the next thing to do. It was that offer of here's the next step, and it's worked.
I know you have a busy day ahead of you, so we'll wrap up here. But first, just what are your touring plans for the new album cycle?
We have a lot of shows booked for the fall. A few in Canada, but mostly in the States initially, and then we start off in the East and end up in the West. But there's I don't know how many shows now, but we're covering most of North America pretty well.
And I almost never ask about an album title because, frankly, it's usually cliche and it's or just taken from a song title or lyric or whatever. But I'm actually curious. The whole Crowing Ignites, I know what those two words mean individually, obviously, but I actually have no idea. I'm just curious what that's all about.
Well, there's a story there. The Cockburn is a Scottish name, and there's a clan that's the Cockburn, from the southeast corner of Scotland, historically. Back in the day, that clan, along with other ones, had a chief. The Highland clans kept their chiefs, and some of them still have a chief, I think. But the Cockburn, being lowlanders, operated kind of a little differently, and somewhere in the 1600s or 1700s, there were no more clan chiefs. But before that point, some chief had come up with a family crest, like a coat of arms, and a badge that went with that, and a family motto. And the family motto is a Latin phrase that it says "Accendit Cantu," and I'd seen that translated as "Music excites," which I thought was pretty cool when we first discovered that. One of my brothers stumbled on that fact, and then. I saw another translation, so-called, of it that was like, he arouses us by crowing. And the crest has a rooster on it, right? So I thought, that's not a translation. I mean, these things they're saying totally different things, or similar but different things. And so I looked up the Latin, and I studied Latin a little in high school, so I had some sense of how it works. And the phrase accendit cantu literally translates as crowing ignites. So those other offerings in English are interpretations of what that might mean, but it just seemed to me that the original words have the punch to them. I mean, it's like so Scottish sounding. Crowing ignites, here come the bagpipes. And when I was quite tickled over all this, and my wife said, "You got to use that. Like, that should be the title of your album." That seemed like a really good idea, so it is.
Yeah, it's a good story to leave off on. Bruce, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for doing this.
Nice to talk to you too, John. All the best.